Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Checking. Great. Okay, so really where this interest in mine closure, it's come a long time for me, starting with an interest in mining in the environment, which, as Orengwe says, it goes back a long way. I think I was just thinking I've probably known I've probably known him through a lot of his professional career. And then over the past couple of years, working with the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources quite closely on the development of the National Mine Closure Strategy. I thought I would start with a picture of an old mine, because that's been one of the major focuses that people have. So this is the Vancouver Portland Cement Company around 1919. Cut to a recent photograph and it looks like that. And that looks great. That's fantastic. It's now called the Butchart Gardens, but I think one of the most important things that it employs 50 full-time staff. It has a fascinating history that sort of tracks the history of garden design and gardening and so on. But the critical thing is, I'm not sure how many people a limestone mine would have employed 100 years ago, but here is an example of something sustainable which has been built out of an abandoned mine or out of a closed mine. I think it's important what this presentation is about and what it isn't about, because I think they're equally important. And what it is, it's much more about a framework for thinking, principles, a provocation around compliance, which comes, I think, from having worked not for a regulator, but within an environment where regulation is critical. For a long time, there's some ideas which I've picked up around compliance, which I'd like to share with you. Then really starting the conversation and looking at governance in all directions. What it isn't is a recipe book. And the reason for that is that every mine is different, every region is different. And as you'll see later on, I firmly believe that mine closure has to belong to the mine which is implementing it. It can't be a recipe book which is imposed either from a regulator or from a consultant as a tick list of do all of these things and you'll be closed. It's also not a consultancy pitch. It's not saying, I can help you do all of this, although I hope I could. It's not a bureaucratic checklist, a technical manual. And there is, and I think we all working in the space realize there's no promise of certainty. One of the questions I think we need to look at, and there's a figure which keeps popping up, I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, but there's a figure which pops up which says that the average South African mine has a life of 30 years. Now, I can think of mines with a life of 3 years and 5 years and 7 years and 70 years, and mines which operated for 100 years. So that's what an average is. But you can almost guarantee that when your mine needs to apply for a closure certificate, the closure regulations and the closure landscape is going to look different to what it looks like right now. And how do we prepare for this? So what is mine closure? When does it happen? And it's all of these things and all of these things together. And I think the sum is greater than, the total is greater than the sum of the parts. There's an administrative process. There's the process of how do you actually apply for a closure certificate, and that's neatly laid out in various regulations, and we would hope they're not too contradictory. It's an engineering process, and critically, when you speak to people at Department of Environment, they're very, very strong on this thing. It's an engineering process. It's physically doing things to decommission and close the mine. It's a financial process. You have a closure plan. The closure plan leads to a financial provision. Towards the end of the life of a mine, that has to be drawn down and translated into closure activities. And there are formulae and a whole lot of accounting and financial models which have to be in place for it to work. If I think of examples, I can think of examples of mines who are sitting with remaining closure activities, money in the financial provision, which they can't access because they haven't done things yet. So there's a lot of financial modeling which goes into it. There's the question of compliance, which we always have to look at. However, the compliance landscape has changed and is changing, and I think it's important to keep ahead of it in some ways. And then it's the social process. It's the impact that you have on surrounding and other affected communities. Now, one of the insights which I got here came, in fact, from Professor Mike Solomon at UCT, who introduced the idea that a mine closure in Mpumalanga has an impact, and if you measure its impact, there's a specific impact in Kempton Park, where Caterpillar and all of those companies tend to have their headquarters. So you've got this impact on other affected communities, also on labor sending areas. And we need to take all of these things into account. They may not be part of the strict regulatory requirements for closure, but they're impacts which are going to affect how we close and how a mine closes and what happens after closure. Right, so the first principle, and I think this is really critical, is the idea of life of mine closure planning. When does mine closure planning start? It starts before mining. In fact, if you go and you read the regulations, you will see that your closure plan is one of the requirements for permitting, even at a prospecting level. There needs to be a closure plan. Now, are the closure plans all up to date? Are the closure plans all realistic? Are they all entirely compliant? Of course, we know that that's a very variable, it's a moving target. But a closure plan has to be acknowledged from before the start of mining. And it now takes the form, it requires a thing called an agreed to end land use that comes across all of our regulations. And it takes the form of a thing called a final rehabilitation, decommissioning, and mine closure plan. It's a bit of a mouthful. What happens with this? The accuracy of cost estimates, the knowledge that we use to derive a closure plan, and so on, this all grows over the life of the mine. And there's legal provision that the financial provision can be adjusted over time both as the mine develops and as the cost of closure changes. And ideally, if you're doing life of mine closure planning, I think this is a very critical thing, that having this long-term view allows the latent and residual costs to be minimized. Because that's one of the problems we have with a regulatory, the change from MPRDA to NEMA is this question of what are long-term and what are latent and residual costs, and how do we manage them? And then, of course, I think we all agree concurrent rehabilitation reduces liability and the required financial provision. We have two rehabilitation pathways. We have what I call the deferred rehabilitation pathway. And I spent some of the week listening to a lot of work on early stage prospecting, in fact, pre-competitive prospecting, target generation, and so on. And for a large part, people have this idea that closure is something which happens at the end, and the revenue, the cost comes in after the mine stops. It results in short-term cost savings. However, the costs are deferred. The liability, the ad hoc liabilities, the things that were unexpected, they pile up. And it generally will increase the life cycle cost of closure, increase regulatory risk, that if you haven't planned properly and you then try and close, all of the surprises get in the way of a clean closure and a closure certificate. And it results in a decrease in trust between all parties. I worked a couple of years ago on a project where we looked at a trialogue of the mine, the regulator, and society. And you need to have trust in all three directions. It's very difficult to build. Planned closure pathway, on the other hand, we plan alongside the mining life cycle. Environmental liabilities are more predictable. Life cycle costs are more predictable. You reduce risk and you can build, and this really has to happen in parallel, that you have to build this mutual trust in these relationships. So having an idea of what this is going to look like, this is a very simple curve. It looks at the revenue from a mine over its life. During prospecting, nothing comes in, nothing goes out. Well, a lot goes out sometimes, but the revenue rises as the mine develops, then towards closure it decreases. You have your closure period and you have your post-closure period. But what happens if we start adding other curves to this? So there's our deferred rehabilitation pathway. We save a lot of costs at the beginning, which is great. We miss the revenue bump, which is good for shareholders sometimes, but so long as the shareholders know where to get out. But what do? We end up with these large liabilities and costs, which occur at a point when the mine is not creating any more revenue. Bring in the planned closure pathway. If it's done properly, the long-term overall cost should be greater, but it's going to cost more at the early stages of a mine when revenue generation is low. So there is this complexity which has to be managed. It's a question of that it actually is more expensive to run a mine properly than it is to defer everything to the end. What does that leave us with? If we do it properly, a low residual liability, we have high residual liabilities. And the big challenge over here for all of us, I think, is this question of persistent water treatment costs. Been doing some work, or been working for a long time in the Witwatersrand, where the state is carrying that can, and the costs are extremely high. We're all paying for it in our taxes and in Gauteng in our water pricing. Right, and then there's another thing which comes in over here, and this is a substitute of post-mining economy. So this is what's going to keep the community going when the mine closes. So it's not necessarily to scale relative to the mine. However, what's really important is this has to start during the mining period. This can't be deferred to the end, and there is a little bit of a regulatory challenge which we have to work our way through there. If we're looking beyond compliance, and I think beyond compliance really means anticipating what's going to hit us in 10, 20 or 30 years' time. The status quo for a lot of mines has been the deferred rehabilitation pathway. The NEMA and the regulations encourage and even in some cases enforce this closure planning, a planned closure pathway. And the spirit, if not the letter of the law, encourages economic diversification towards a post-mining economy. One of the fascinating things about working on the National Mine Closure Strategy was because we were working with government officials, with regulators, they want to know what laws do we have to change, what new laws do we need, what regulations do we need to change. And the reality is not very much. If we look at the regulations, already closure has to start at the commencement of the operation. Rehabilitation to a natural state, all this thing of a predetermined and agreed standard. And that's the critical thing. We need to quantify and manage risks. There's a concept in the financial provision of a closure vision. So you need to sketch what is this closed mine going to look like. The MPRDA requires a future forum. The guidelines tell us this is participation by employees, mine management, communities, government authorities, and community organizations. This is really where we've got to start creating this vision. The social and labor plan is also looking at how do we contribute towards the socioeconomic development. And again, this whole concept of an agreed environmental state comes up. Where do these laws come from? A lot of them from the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're now getting towards 4 things which are coming out that we need. We need to plan through the life cycle of the mine. We need ecological stewardship. We need to think ecologically to close a mine. We need to look at sustainable economic development concurrent with mining, and we need to build our consultative processes. Who does the mine closure? If we think of these 4 phases, prospecting, mining, closure, and post-closure, right, we need to develop the closure vision. All of these things happen at the beginning. When you're developing a mining work program, are you thinking about how you're going to close things? I know every environmental manager you ever speak to on a mine says the mining people, they don't think about closure, they just go in and do things and then add them on afterwards. I think we can all accept that that's going to often be much more expensive than planning with closure in mind. During mining, we've got to evolve this vision. The world changes, and I think that's really, really critical. The world changes, so we can't be too prescriptive early in a mine's life. However, as the mining work program evolves, the closure plan must evolve with it. And then monitoring of performance, reporting, auditing, and all of those things. At the point of closure, partner with stakeholders. We've got to achieve the vision. Then we do the decommissioning, rehabilitation, and so on. And again, transparent reporting, auditing, consultation. Post-closure, we really have to start building the post-closure economy as early as possible in the mining life cycle. Post-closure, what are we doing? We're empowering the stakeholders to advance the closure vision, managing residual liabilities, and there is legal provision for a closure rehabilitation company. It's something that's not very well developed in practice at this point, but there are I think there are a lot of possibilities there. And then, and I think this is really a measure of success, is scaling down the monitoring and reporting. That as the closure vision is realized, you don't need to be reporting as often if things are working. However, you need a documented and measurable program. Right. Really key to this, open and transparent consultation, this adaptive closure planning, and then concurrent economic diversification. Right, so it's a transdisciplinary process. I think we're always good at our own disciplines, all of us are. And multidisciplinary processes are we start sort of mixing between them and speaking to each other. Transdisciplinary is where we're much more integrative. Really just to look what are the key issues here. We have this life cycle closure planning. I want to say this a lot. And the agreed to end land use becomes critical so there's something to plan towards. Ecological stewardship, we have baselines and targets. We need an ongoing independent review process. We'll discuss a little bit more who does various things. And then it needs to align with the end land use. And this is quite an important, it's an area which gets missed quite often, is that the end land use need not be restoring nature to what it was before mining. And I think that's a mind shift that a lot of people have to make. I always think the most successful mine closure stories in South Africa are to be found. I was there this morning, Council for Geoscience offices in Silverton, which grew up around the silver industry around sort of early 20th century, mainly late 19th, early 20th century. That closed down in the early to mid 20th century, and you're left with this industrial area where you have all of your light industries and some of your larger industries located within Silverton. Kuilsrivier in the Western Cape, a lot of people say, was that a mining town? Similar history, grew up around tin mining. And then, of course, Johannesburg, that you have the economic and the financial engine of, people would say, the African continent, built up on the back of a mining industry. Compliance really is our minimum requirement, and we need to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the multinational companies much more, but this is part of what underpins our regulations and legislation. And then we're working towards the idea of collaborative regional development platforms. It aligns well with parts of the MPRDA. A lot of, you look at parts of Section 43, that's what it's saying to do. It really allows us to integrate mines with the local and district development objectives, manage cumulative and integrated impacts on a more regional basis or a more area-based basis, and then to establish shared governance platforms, shared leadership, shared skills bases, and so on, particularly useful when a mine starts to withdraw after closure. So what does it look like under the same headings? Ongoing transparent stakeholder engagement is absolutely critical. Better alignment, building these sustainable economies, aiming for the closure vision. Any sort of environmental process, you're constantly looking at feedbacks. You do something, what impact does it have? You predict it. You need monitoring to really go back and see how well did this work and how can we improve? And then monitoring and action on results. Again, we've got to find a way to integrate mining and mine closure with local and regional economic initiatives. A mine, we all know this, mines attract a lot of people. They don't necessarily employ all of those people. The mining economy creates economic growth, economic opportunities within an area, and how do we sustain that when mines close? I think the worst example I've heard is towns in Germany where they pump water from the water source into the treatment plants and straight into the sewers to prevent the sewers from blocking because the populations have shrunk so much. And we don't need to do that. We need to find ways where you have multiple mines adjacent to each other, neighboring mines. How do we align the closure schedules so that we have no delays, no stragglers? We don't have, because two mines share pumping infrastructure, for argument's sake. It was a huge problem in the Witwatersrand, that one mine shouldn't delay another mine's closure, but at the same time, we don't leave people behind. We don't sit like ERPMs, which ended up pumping the entire central basin's water. And then we need really to We need to find a way to survive the transition and to guide the transition and own the transition from mining to a post-mining economy. Who does it? Really, our planning is where we have the interface between environment and mining. We also need to think our monitoring, auditing, and reporting. So we need to be honest about this and remember that this is a feedback system so that we can do better in future. Ecological stewardship, I think one of the shortcomings I see is that we don't have enough mining expertise going into how we manage the environment. It's great. I remember talking to a mine manager once, and we were looking at a mine and realizing that the overburden stockpiles were too high. There was too much compaction, and his comment was, "But a drag line doesn't work that way. This is what the equipment we do and the mining methods produces. How do we adapt? How do we make it work?" We need to have the skills in economics, business development, specific skills. Agriculture is a fascinating one because it comes into a lot of revegetation, regeneration, uses a lot of agricultural skills. And then looking at ways, how do we really go beyond the sort of minimum compliance approach? When we get onto our collaborative regional development, we need to find ways to balance the roles of mine management, because mine management needs to operate mines. That's their function here. And then they need to close the mines. Municipalities which need to perform, I don't want to talk too much about that. It was an assumption we had to make developing the National Mine Closure Strategy, is that government at all levels is going to perform and going to operate. And we need to find ways as a country to get that to work. Communities need to thrive, and where necessary, we need independent facilitators. Often bringing somebody in from outside can find these balance points, can find out where we need to be going. And then we need to look at consensus building and a focus on implementation. So if we look at who this involves, this is a very interesting thing that our environmental assessment professionals, their role is critical at the beginning of the process. So they need to define these baselines, what monitoring is needed, what the EMP has to look like, and how do we align the closure plan with a mining work program. In parallel, the ESG teams need to build engagement platforms which run throughout this process. Once it comes to implementation, the operational mine staff are the best people for this. Operational mine staff know mines better than external people coming in. The environmental control officers, they need to ensure this alignment between the EMP and the closure plan. And quite exciting, I heard that the regulatory body or the professional body is looking at a better system of managing environmental control officers. Auditors are the independent oversight. At some point, the mine is going to start handing over assets to communities. The management of liabilities has to be built into this. The long-term stewardship of those assets have to be built into this. And at this point, having conformed with an approved plan, having measurable targets, having met those targets, having auditors signed off on those targets, really enables this handover. And this is the point of closure certification, which has become such a problem, because nobody seems to know exactly what's expected of them, including the regulators who have to sign off. And then over time, the mine's role reduces as this closure vision is realized. So what we have to do is that if we can mine in a way that limits long-term liabilities, including water management, that handover can happen. If that handover doesn't happen, the closure certificate becomes more and more difficult to visualize. Right, so what are we looking at? Life cycle planning, measurable targets, alignment between mining, environment and closure, stakeholder engagement, all of these things that I think we're used to. And the responsibility for closure lies with the mine. It's not the consultant, not the EEP, not the auditor. And the alignment with mining processes is absolutely critical. It's very easy to say we're going to really just get by on what the environmental monitoring or the environmental regulation does. But at closure, all of this stuff starts to catch up. The requirements under NEMA over here are really for competence at the mines level with oversight via the auditing process. And I think this is where I spoke about a change in the legislative philosophy has gone from one of the government will prescribe everything you have to do, and if as you go through it, you do it and you tick it off, to the NEMA approach, which is much more you tell the government what you're planning to do, how you expect to, what you expect the outcomes to be. Once they've signed off on that, it's your responsibility to demonstrate that you've achieved that. Right, so water. What about water? And really, it's since 2014 now. So it's 12 years we've had this implementation of the One Environmental System, which brings the NEMA and MPRDA requirements together. But what about the National Water Act? National Water Act sits outside of the One Environmental System, although there are cooperative governance principles, practices, forums, and so on that bring the two together. So we have a single legislative system for mining, which looks at the environment and mine closure, and then a separate act looking at the abstraction, discharge, and other uses of water. However, and this is really important, that the Department of Water and Sanitation has the authority to oppose a closure application. So it's one of the areas which is currently under review, but the Department of Water and Sanitation's role will probably just be better defined, not really change. So what you have is you have two regulatory systems which need to be aligned. So this integration is absolutely critical. We need to find a way. We need to find ways to do it. We need to do it at the level of the mine. We need to do it at the level of the catchment. And a lot of the time, it really is the responsibility of the mine to ensure that the integration is happening. And I've seen a lot of cases where it is happening very well, where you have active engagement of mines with catchment management forums, for example, catchment management agencies. Also areas where it's not as well, it's not being run as well. So how about long-term water management? How do we really get into the green pathway, not the red pathway? And this is the first point, is that pollution prevention at source offers us sustainable solutions. Neglecting water management during mining creates long-term liabilities. So as I said, a lot of my experience comes from the Witwatersrand, where water was something which was deferred from what I learned in a lot of the history that I had to learn, that in 1893 mining reached the water table in Johannesburg. So from 1893 to about the late 1990s, water management was largely seen as something we'll deal with later, and we're seeing the consequences of that now. We look at what we've got in our legislation. We've got Government Notice 704, we've got the Department of Water and Sanitation's mine water policy, and we've got the mine water management best practice guidelines that probably are due for an update, but they are an extremely useful document or set of documents. And what they give us a hierarchy of mine water management. And what you see is pollution prevention, water reuse and reclamation, with water treatment and discharge really seen as the lowest points in the hierarchy. That's what we do if nothing else has worked. How do we enable this? We monitor water quality and flow. Very, very important to know how much water are we managing, not just what is the quality. And I think it's a shortcoming in a lot of water quality plans, because mining is seen as a polluter. We worry more about the quality than the flow. And when it comes to designing water management systems, the engineering, the first question you asked is not what is the water quality, but how much water is there to manage. And then, and this is an absolutely critical part, preserving data, preserving information. So it's extremely difficult to come after the mine is closed and try and develop an optimal solution. And what you tend to do is you tend to make more and more conservative assumptions and over-design everything. And that's why long-term water treatment has become so expensive, is because everything we're doing with managing the worst-case scenario, which I think as we all know, the worst-case scenario very rarely happens, but we have to provide for it. So, road to a closure certificate. And I think this is a very familiar cycle. Say what you do what you say, prove it and improve it. It fits into most management systems. It's the basis of an ISO management system and so on. So how do we do that? Say what you do. This is your planning and then your document control and maintenance. And that's one of the critical parts of closure planning, is that a mine should be able to, now, for example, a mine, I actually worked with people, it's been quite interesting finding out how many people have South Deep Gold Mine as part of their career. When I worked on South Deep, it was an exploration site. I was busy doing all sorts of geophysical exploration on that site. There's a generation who has grown with that mine and retired on that mine, and the mine has another 70 years to go. So if there isn't documentation describing what happened early on, it's going to be very difficult a generation or two now to actually manage anything. And do what you say, implement your plan, do your concurrent rehabilitation, and then this internal tracking and audit function becomes critical. Auditing, it needs to not be a punishment at the end, it needs to be a process by which we improve. Prove it, we have annual reports, we have 5-yearly audits, documentation, communication, and record keeping. I was asked to help with a mine closure, which is still pending. I'm not going to mention which mine it is, but what we have is a dispute between the regulator who says, we told you to backfill the open pit, and the mine that said, no, we said we were going to develop a pit lake. Should be a very familiar dispute for a lot of people. And what appears to me in this case is that neither party can actually document what was agreed to. So now they're sitting saying, but we said, but we said, but we said. And that's not the way to do this. Now, if either party could say, here is a record of all communication which we have had on this, and this is what it tells us, this would immediately be resolved. And this would tell mining company what to do to close, regulator what to regulate around closure. But this doesn't happen. So this is a case where we need to have this sort of meticulous documentation, communication, and record keeping in all parts. All parties need to be doing it. And then we need to look at the review and update of closure plans. And again, you're going to keep seeing this, documentation, communication, and record keeping. Because if you at some point have said, look, I think pit lakes are a great idea, and here's a study showing that it's the optimal closure, and it, using the words out of the regulations, it aligns with the principles of sustainable development. You need to have a sign-off on that. It's not enough to say, oh, but we did the work 10 years ago and we said that. I think that's a very critical thing, is this thing of documentation, communication, record keeping. So let's have a look at what happens when things go right. Believe it or not, this is the same mine site. I'm not sure if the photograph is from exactly the same angle. But this is the Zwenkau coal mine sometime in the 1970s or 1980s. It was mined in the old German Democratic Republic prior to German reunification. Environmental controls were actually there, but not very well enforced. Record keeping this is something which always intrigues me about East German mines. There were a lot of records kept. So there was a lot of records of what had been done, but not very much done to rehabilitate it. And the end product was a pit lake. And I think this is one of the examples where people talk about pit lakes, where it's been really, really successful. What have they done? They've transformed a number of open cast lignite mines into these recreational lakes, which was identified as a societal need in that area. So it's not saying that we're going to create recreational lakes on every open pit everywhere in the country. Remote areas, but this is an area where you had a relatively large population who had very little by way of recreational facilities. There are parallel programs in the area around uranium mines and just industrial sites which have been closed down. And what it's done is it's transformed mining legacies into productive environments. And then a critical thing in this part of Germany, it's built local academic and technical excellence. So you've, in parallel with closing mines and achieving a lot, there's been a lot of expertise developed, which is now available for training. Very active consulting industry based out of that part of Saxony. They also have one of the oldest mining universities in the world. So there's a tradition of expertise, but this has been a very important spin-off. What happens when they don't work? For people who knew the late Phil Hobbs, hydrogeologist, did a lot of work in mining environments, and this is him looking relatively disgusted at a sort of acid mine drainage seep out of an old, it's in fact they're out of a backfill area with brown coal. And it was really small differences between the groundwater and pit lake levels that led to the ongoing acidification of some of these pit lakes. So it didn't work everywhere. They require ongoing management and neutralization. However, I think this is really important. The spin-off knowledge and expertise has led to, again, expertise in in-pit mine water neutralization, which is now used all over the world where it's needed. But the ongoing cost of this really highlights the importance of life cycle closure planning, of understanding the hydrogeological regime before you start digging. So what are we going to do to design futures? This is always the sort of uncomfortable discussion, is that we have a narrowing window of opportunity to enable climate resilient development. I think we all know what we need to do. This sidebar has popped up a few times. We all know what's needed, but we're not exactly sure when and how to manage the just transition to ensure that it happens and that it's just. And I think that's a critical thing that we need to work out. How do we get this to happen with as little disruption as possible? These things, this is a diagram from one of the IPCC reports, but it has these shock waves that disrupt development. I think the current summer in Europe is one of these shock waves. I don't know if people have got friends, family there. The good side is my sister was telling me that her boss basically had cocktails in the morning and everybody could go home because it was too hot to work. But really what is happening is we want to avoid and absorb these shocks as much as possible. What's happening at the same time, we see this phenomenal decrease in the cost of renewable energy. And I think that's it's something which we need to acknowledge, that really if we are building new energy, we're not looking at older technologies. How does this happen? It's a very interesting thing. We're all familiar with Moore's law, which talks about how IT, double the number of transistors on a chip every 18 months. But Wright's law says that it's interesting, it was developed. The question which was being answered is, why does it keep getting cheaper to build aeroplanes? In the 1930s, when people were learning how to build aeroplanes as useful tools rather than as sort of novelties. Really, the more time a task has been performed, the less time is required on each subsequent iteration. And it's interesting because different technologies have different, what do they call it? It's a learning curve and different learning rates. Renewable energy is around 20% per year. Coal is extremely inelastic. It's got a very low learning curve because we're good at doing it. We know what to do. Welding has a learning curve of something like 90%. A welder with a year's training is much more productive than those of us who go out and try and fix something over the weekend. Why do mines close? And the classic reasons we always taught, and we sort of learned when we started learning these topics. The two major reasons are either a resource is depleted or the market changes. The resource depletion is one we're familiar with, and it's the underlying assumption in our planning, mine planning, closure planning, and in our legislation. Market changes are going to be driven more and more by climate, and then by public opinion and market forces. So if people won't invest in something, it's not going to happen. If you have climate shocks, it shifts public opinion much more than a steady rising curve. So it's something we need to really look at, is how do we design these futures? I have an idea that we really are looking at two timelines. And if we look at, we seem to in South Africa, a lot of the time our discussions around Industry 4.0, but we have this accepted cycle. Industry 1.0 was steam. The steam engine really replaced physical endurance. Industry 2.0 was when we got electrification going, which replaced the lovely term, replaced sensory navigation. It allowed us to see at night. The interesting thing, the first city in the world to have electric streetlights was New York, as you would expect. The second one was Kimberley. And it's an interesting thing, if you're interested in mining history, is that a lot of South Africa's mining history was electrified because of when our mining industry developed. Industry 3.0, really from the 1970s onward, is mechanization, automation. So it replaces manual repetition, it replaces craft knowledge, that a machine starts building something at least as well as or a lot cheaper than a person can. 2011 onwards, we have our digitalization. It replaces the isolated mining operation. It means we keep hearing about these things. I attended a talk earlier in the week about marine surveying, where marine surveying is done by a drone operated, and marine survey companies have control centers scattered around the world so that they can have 24/7 shifts without people working night shifts. And very recently, we have Industry 5.0, which is human-machine collaboration, which is really a more human-centered look at how we do economic development. I'll give you a reference for this. This was looking more at safety. But in essence, what we need to do is we have mining as we've known it, which really goes up to around Industry 4.0. We need to use 21st century thinking and ingenuity to close mines which developed using ideas which date back really as much as 250 years. A lot of our mining is still based on methods and stuff that's been continuously improving over about 250 years. So we've got the mining as we knew it, and we've got the mining as we will shape it, and that's really where mine closure in future is going to have to fit in. The obligatory AI picture, which you have to put into every presentation now, it seems. And this is an idea which has really occurred to me. It's starting to, in a more isolated way, to come into the mining industry, particularly things like managing truck fleets and managing plants and so on. But it's this idea of a digital twin. That if you have a rehabilitation model, you have a 3D model of a mine, you have all of these things being continually monitored, continuously updated, you're actually moving towards the point where you start to have a digital twin. If you can close the digital twin, you have a much better chance of closing the mine. And it's going to start telling you, you're able to add permutations to things. So you're able to say, for example, what is the difference between, from a closure point of view, between different mining options, and able to simulate things into the future as opposed to just looking for what's cheapest in the next quarter, which is what causes a lot of these problems. Okay, what can old mines be used for? Energy storage, a very interesting idea. You have a lot of vertical separation. So currently the deepest mine for energy storage, I'm just watching time now, is Salmi mine in Finland, 1,400 meters deep. It's the deepest, the world's highest head in underground energy storage, with the lower reservoir developed, and this is effectively during periods of energy production, pump water up, during periods of energy demand, allow water to flow down. It's very good for balancing renewable energy. But the lower reservoir is not using the mine tunnels, it's actually developed off mining infrastructure. Much smaller scale, Kidston in Australia, or much shallower, large amounts of water, moving water between two open pits with a bit of a vertical difference between the two. It's something which hasn't really got off the ground in South Africa. I had a look around for mine sites because we all have an idea that a mine site can be repurposed for an industrial site. But if you look at the companies who are occupying Harworth Advanced Manufacturing Park, we have UK Atomic Energy Agency on an old coal and steel site. McLaren does their carbon fiber work there. Rolls-Royce has some of their high-tech stuff there. So it's a very interesting thing saying that we're going to take a piece of land which we would normally expect to be economically depressed after mine closure and actually bringing in high-tech industries. Also, cultural and recreational sites not to be underestimated. I think we're all familiar with Gold Reef City. We sometimes forget that it was an operating mine. It's interesting because from the mine health and safety point of view, it still regulates Gold Reef City. It has to be the safest mine that I know of, which has a regulatory approval to take school children underground in large groups. But here we have, these are a site called Ferropolis, also in Germany. There it is as a mining site, and it's become, here is the European Drifting Championship, here is a music festival, a lot of stuff going on. Also closer to home, the Formula K site in Benoni. That's where it started, and this is what's happening. It's actually quite fun working out there because you have these tiny little kids karting on the site. You think this is the future Lewis Hamilton being formed. So what is our take-home message? Really, closure is not an event. I like to think of it as a journey and a culture. It starts before mining and continues beyond it. The cultural side is that, and if you look at some sites, you still have a lot of mining culture long after mines close. Integration is possible even if the legislation diverges. And I think what's critical here is that the mines themselves need to build these bridges, that there is a lot of willingness to build bridges, to link things. Pollution prevention is really our only sustainable water strategy. The moment you start with long-term treatment, it's really sustainable from a financial point of view. It's technically feasible. And we see the Ebelathlenic plant, but it's not over its life cycle financially competitive with piping in clean water from other sources. And there's quite a large gap still between water provision. An important area to look at with water, though, and I think it's often neglected, is not the price of the water that's sold, but what the water can enable. So what water can enable, particularly in drier areas. If you have a water source, or you can manage mine water to provide a more reliable water source, that can stimulate local economic activity. And the multiplier with water, I think we all know, is huge. Collaborate, communicate, consult, that mines exist in a broader context. The closure needs to align with other mines and with local needs. The regeneration, it's a term you're going to hear more and more in the coming years. It's interesting. I would really say in the past, optimistically 5 years, probably a bit less. The word has moved from the sort of fringe of organic agriculture right into mine rehabilitation, agriculture, a whole lot of areas looking at regeneration. The closed mine that sustains the local ecology and economy. And then this whole thing, say what you do what you say, document it. Communicate, keep records, and that's going to unlock closure certificates. So thank you. This is where I said at the end, it's not a consulting pitch, but these are contact details if anybody wants to contact me, more information on this. Thank you.
Dr. Coetzee, that was, to say wonderful is a bit of an understatement. Really a masterclass on some considerations for all of us in the sector. So on behalf of the Coaltech community and the broader coal community, I cannot thank you enough. We do, however, have about 9 minutes to take questions if there are any, and I would encourage members to ask questions. It's not every day that we have someone who has spent over 34 years of their life thinking about the topic of mine closure. Can we maybe have 1 or 2 questions? If there are any, I'm just checking if there's anything at all in the chat box. We have the chairperson of our Surface Environment Steering Committee, Mr. Van Wyk, over to you.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for that presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. My main question is, the Department of DNPR is busy looking at potentially adopting the same approach that Australia is utilizing, where you've got a time-based rehabilitation targets that need to be met and handed over to the post-closure management strategy. In their case, a lot of it is for agriculture, so handing the land back to the farmer. Do you think that's a potential approach to address that net liability rehabilitation cost versus that deferred, and prevent mines within South Africa to push rehab into that deferred bracket?
I think if you look, it's quite an interesting, the one environmental system is quite an interesting system because you have an act, the rules set by Department of Environment Affairs and enforced by Department of Mineral Petroleum Resources. So it's actually, in a sense, it's quite a robust system. And it is to a large extent, that's possible. And this really comes into this thing of saying that a lot of the stuff is about the art of the possible. And we found out that that everybody was saying what has to change in regulations and very little has to change. If you have a rehabilitation plan or a closure plan has to be time-based. And if you have a farmer, for example, a farmer who is going to take land back under certain circumstances and a plan to get it into the state that they want, that also, a time-based system is an excellent way of doing it. One of the regulatory hurdles we have at the moment is the question of partial closure that a mine, particularly in the coal industry, where you have the sort of open cast mining where you are rehabilitating as you mine. It's quite difficult to get mining land out of the jurisdiction of the Mine Health and Safety Act, which makes it extremely difficult to farm on rehabilitated land while a mine is still operating. But I think, yes, that's a challenge which needs to be, there is actually a legal way to do it, involving subdivision and redefining mining rights. But it's not ideal because you're using a piece of legislation which was designed for another purpose to make it possible. But yes, I think that it has to be time-based.
We had a hand from Festus, who heads our Future Technology Steering Committee, Mr. Litiane.
Okay, thanks, Aburengwi, and thanks to for the comprehensive presentation. I think my question has been partially answered. My question was really, if you look at South Africa, from a legislative point of view, what is that needs to change to start changing the mindset and approach from closure to regeneration? And I hear the prof saying very little needs to change. Yeah, maybe you can expand a bit.
I think very little needs to change. And I think one of the most important lessons, and if we look at the current state of the financial provision regulations, what happened is you have a regulation which was drafted in 2015. And yes, there were problems with it. Everybody knows that. Everybody acknowledges that. But it's been amended and you have amendments which are not implemented. So it keeps getting amended and there keeps being a new version of the regulation which is waiting for implementation. During that period, the only advantage it has is that the industry has a pretty good idea of what's coming. But during that period, mines actually have to carry on operating and get towards closure. There is very little in the current, as I say, apart from the issue of partial closure, of releasing land, releasing closed portions of a mine while the mine is still operating. There's very little which is a regulatory hurdle at the moment. There are issues where the regulations may be complex, may be quite clumsy, but there's a lot that you can do. And I think one of the discussions that we were having while I was still at the Council for Geoscience was this whole issue of the closure certificates really needing more certainty and clarity. I think areas of regulatory uncertainty need to be approached. The danger always is that this is an opposition, it's seen as an opposition, as a confrontational process of developing regulations. And it would be much easier if there was a much more collaborative process involved. But I don't think there's much that stops you from doing a proper mine closure. Yes.
Great. It seems we don't have any more questions. Again, Dr. Coetzee, thank you for the time that you've taken to prepare such a wonderful presentation, which we will upload on our YouTube channel. So those who couldn't join, who had wanted to join, you can let them know that the episode will be available. With that, Dr. Coetzee, I see we've got a few of our board members on the call, which is always great to see. We've got the broader leadership team of the Coaltech community, which is also really good. But we also have people who make sure that these masterclasses continue to be as successful as they have been, so that we continue to empower ourselves with the insights that people like yourself do provide. So Thank you again, and thank you to everyone for joining. Carmen, as always, for helping in putting this together. It's been a really wonderful masterclass. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely Thursday afternoon, one that started with a great celebration this morning, so it's a good end to the day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
We'll see you in a month's time.
Great, thank you very much. And this morning's my morning activities all started a little bit late. People seem to filter in quite late this morning. Great, thanks very much.
All right. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yes, bye-bye.